"My housekeeper," the Duke of Aldermere said when the question could no longer be put off. "Mrs. Ellery, she has the running of the house tonight." And the woman in grey curtsied to the cluster of guests exactly as a superior servant should, neither too low nor too proud, and said nothing at all, and the guests looked at her for the half-second one looks at furniture, and then looked away. Back to the champagne and the candlelight, and the season's largest gathering, satisfied a housekeeper. Of course, who else would a woman in plain grey be, moving so competently through a duke's ballroom, seeing that the ices did not melt and the musicians did not flag, and 400 of the most important people in England wanted for nothing. It was the spring of 1817, and Aldermere House blazed on Grosvenor Square, with 2,000 candles, and the Duke of Aldermere had told a small and careful lie, and the woman who let him tell it stood quietly at the edge of the great room with a ring of keys at her waist, and watched the people who had once destroyed her family enjoy themselves in her husband's house. She was 24, dark-haired, with a still and unremarkable face that the guests had already forgotten, and she was the Duchess of Aldermere, though not one soul in that ballroom knew it but the Duke, and she had agreed to be called his housekeeper for one evening, and she had her own reasons, which were older and colder than her husband yet suspected. When the guests laughed at some small wit about the difficulty of good staff, she smiled, the pleasant blank smile of a servant who knows her place. When a marchioness snapped her fingers for more wine and called her girl, she fetched it herself, unhurried, and was thanked by no one. She curtsied when she was introduced, and she smiled when they laughed, and she carried the keys at her waist through the whole of that bright, cruel room, and she was patient. She had always been patient. 8 years she had been patient. She could be patient until midnight. To understand the woman in grey, you must go back 8 years. To the spring she had been a different person entirely. In a different house that had also blazed with candles, Ellery Court, in Hertfordshire, the home of Sir Thomas Ellery, Baronet, and his daughter Rosalind, who had been 16 that year and had never in her life carried anyone's keys but her own. The Ellerys had not been grand, but they had been old and honest and unencumbered, and that, it transpired, was a thing a certain kind of man could not abide. His name was Sir Hugh Carmody, and he had come up out of nothing into a great deal of money by the patient ruin of better families than his own. Lending where he saw weakness, manufacturing the defaults he then enforced, and buying with the proceeds a baronetcy, a town house, and a slow, steady welcome into the society of the people he was systematically devouring. He had set his eye on Ellery Court because the land adjoined an estate he meant to build, and when Sir Thomas would not sell, Carmody had ruined him, a forged default on a debt 3 times its true size, a bribed clerk, a foreclosure rushed through before an honest court could be reached. And the thing was done. Sir Thomas Ellery had died within the year of what the physicians called a wasting of the heart, and the family called the truth. And Rosalind, 16 and orphaned and penniless, had gone out of the only home she had ever known with one trunk, and her mother's garnet brooch pinned inside her dress where no creditor could find it, and had become. Because there was nothing else for a ruined gentlewoman to become. A companion, and then a governess in the houses of people who paid her little and saw her less. She had learned in those years the great lesson of the invisible, that a woman no one looks at can see everything. She had watched from the edges of 100 drawing-rooms how the world truly worked, who owed whom, who feared whom, where the bodies of old scandals were buried. And she had kept, through every cramped year, 2 things: her mother's brooch, and a patience that frightened the few who ever saw beneath her quiet. because Rosalind Ellery had also kept something else, recovered piece by careful piece across 8 years of being no one, the proof of what Carmody had done to her father. The bribed clerk, grown old and frightened of his maker. The true figures of the debt. The forged default in Carmody's own commissioning. She had gathered the ruin of the man who ruined her, slowly, the way she did everything, and she had been waiting only for the day she could stand in a room with him and use it. She had not expected that day to arrive by way of a duke. She had met the Duke of Aldermere 2 years before, in the dreariest of circumstances, as the hired companion to his ailing great-aunt. And the meeting had not gone as such meetings were supposed to. He had come to visit the old woman out of duty, a grave, dark-eyed man of 32, with the weight of an indebted dukedom on him, and no apparent expectation of finding anything in his great-aunt's sick-room but tedium, and he had found instead a companion who read to the old terror without flinching at her cruelty, who corrected him, gently and correctly, on a point of history he had got wrong, and who, when he offered her the absent half-crown of charity in his manner that great men offer the help, looked at him with a clear, dark gaze that had nothing of the servant in it at all. "You need not be kind to me as a project, your grace," she had told him that first day, quietly, when his great-aunt dozed. "I am not a thing to be improved by ducal notice. I do my work, I am paid for it, and I ask nothing else of this house. You may keep your condescension for someone who has further to fall." It had been an outrageous thing for a paid companion to say, and she had said it without heat, the way she said everything, and the Duke of Aldermere had gone home and found, to his considerable inconvenience, that he could not stop thinking about the companion who had declined to be condescended to. He came back the following week and found her alone by the window with a book while the old woman slept, and he had prepared, on the ride over, a number of dignified remarks suitable to a duke making conversation with a dependent, and he forgot every one of them. "You are reading her Gibbon," he said instead, foolishly. "She likes to be read the cruel parts," Rosalind said, not looking up. "The fall of things. It comforts her to know that emperors came to bad ends too. I find I do not blame her." She turned a page. "You have ridden 11 miles in the rain, your grace, to sit in a sick-room that smells of camphor with a woman who insulted your waistcoat last Tuesday. I have been wondering why. I had concluded it was duty, but a dutiful man does not look at the clock the way you do when it is time to leave. It was so exactly true, and so exactly the thing no one ever said to him." But the Duke of Aldermere laughed aloud, which startled the cat. "And how do I look at the clock?" As though it were a creditor, she said, and now she did look up, and there was the smallest light of mischief in the still dark face. "I know the look. I keep your great-aunt's accounts as well as her company. The wages here are 3/4 in arrears, which you do not know, because no one tells you anything true. That is the whole disease of men in your position, your grace. You are surrounded by people who have made a study of your face and a profession of agreeing with it. You could say the sky was green and have it confirmed by dinner. It must be unbearably lonely. I have often thought it is the loneliest condition I have ever observed. And I have been a governess." The Duke was quiet a moment, because she had reached into his chest and named the thing he had never found words for, and set it on the table between them like a returned glove. "You are a very impertinent companion," he said at last, without heat. "I am an honest one," Rosalind said, which great houses always mistake for impertinence, having so little to compare it to. "You may dismiss me for it if you like. I have been dismissed for less, and I shall be read Gibbon by someone, somewhere, by Michaelmas." But she was almost smiling, and so was he, and the rain came down on the 11 miles between his world and hers. And the Duke of Aldermere stayed far longer than duty required, and did not once, that afternoon, look at the clock. He came back. He came back a great many times after that, on a great many flimsy pretexts of duty, and the old woman, who missed nothing, cackled about it on her deathbed. And slowly, across a year of stolen conversations in a sick room, the grave Duke and the invisible companion had each found in the other the one thing their separate hard lives had taught them to stop expecting. In her, a man who listened when she spoke and weighed what she said. In him, a woman who wanted nothing from his rank and would not lie to him to get it. "I should tell you who I was," she had said to him, the night he asked her, in the cold garden, to be his wife, for she would not let him marry a fiction. "Before you say another word. My father was Sir Thomas Ellery, and he was ruined and killed by a man named Carmody, and I have spent 8 years a servant, and the whole of that time I have been gathering the means to destroy that man, and I will not give it up, not even for you. If you marry me, you marry that. A woman with a reckoning she means to keep." She had looked at him steadily in the dark. Most men would call that unwomanly and run. Most men, the Duke of Aldermere had said, have not had Carmody's hand at their own throat for 3 years, which mine has, for he holds my father's debts and means to do to Aldermere what he did to Ellery Court. I am not running from a woman with a reckoning against Hugh Carmody, Rosalind. I am asking whether she will let me hold her coat. And he had kissed her in the cold garden, once, and what had broken open in Rosalind Ellery was the 8-year-old belief that she would settle her account alone, friendless, with nothing warm in her life but the cold pleasure of justice. And she had married him 3 weeks later, very quietly, and told no one, because a patient woman does not announce her hand before she means to play it. The quiet of the marriage had not been only the Duke's protection of her, it had been, far more, her protection of the plan. For Carmody held the Duke's notes, and Carmody watched the Duke the way he watched all his prey. And the day Hugh Carmody learned that the Duke of Aldermere had married Sir Thomas Ellery's vengeful daughter was the day Carmody would know to call the debt, destroy them both, and bury the proof Rosalind had spent 8 years assembling before she could ever bring it into the light. So they had waited. The Duke had played the indebted, anxious client, lulling Carmody toward overconfidence. Rosalind had completed her evidence in secret, and they had chosen the season's largest ball at Aldermere House, with all of society present as witnesses, as the room in which the reckoning would finally be made, because a man like Carmody could survive a courtroom, with his bought lawyers and his patient appeals, but he could not survive being unmasked in front of the 400 people whose good opinion was the only thing his money had ever bought him. And it had been Rosalind's own cold idea to spend the evening as the housekeeper. "Let me move among them unseen one last time," she had told her husband, who hated the notion. "Let me stand in the room with Carmody and have him look through me as he has looked through me my whole life, and not know that the grey nobody fetching his wine is the hand about to close. I have been invisible 8 years, Theodore. Grant me the use of it one final night. After tonight I shall never be invisible again." He had not liked it, but he had learned in 2 years that his wife's instincts in the matter of Hugh Carmody were not to be argued with, and so he had told the careful lie. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery," and watched, sick with it, as society's finest snapped their fingers at the Duchess of Aldermere. She came face to face with him an hour before midnight, and he did not know her, and that was the sweetest and most dangerous moment of the whole long evening. Sir Hugh Carmody had wanted wine, and the woman in grey had brought it, because that was what the woman in grey did, and he took the glass from her tray without looking at her the way a man takes a thing from a hook on a wall. He was talking, as he took it, to a knot of nervous lordlings who owed him money, and he was talking about the Duke of Aldermere, low and confident, not troubling to lower his voice for a servant, because servants did not signify. A pleasant enough young man, Carmody was saying, swirling the wine Rosalind had poured, but weak in the foundations, like his father. Land rich, purse poor, and a head full of honour where the ledger ought to be. I will have the whole of this. He tipped the glass at the blazing ballroom, the candles, the marble, the 400 guests. Inside 3 years, gentlemen, and the young Duke will be grateful, in the end, to take what I leave him. It is always the proud old houses that fall hardest. They never see it coming, because they cannot imagine a world arranged any way but in their favour. He drank. Mark me. Aldermere is a dead man who has not yet been told, and Rosalind, Duchess of Aldermere, stood not 3 feet away with the wine tray and her mother's brooch under her shawl, and her husband's ruin being promised over her own poured claret. And she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not let one flicker cross her still grey face. She had imagined this man for 8 years. She had built him in her mind into a monster, and here he was, only a vain old thief swirling stolen wine and telling frightened boys how cleverly he would murder her marriage, and she found that the not speaking was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than the funeral, harder than the first cramped governess's bedroom, because every patient year of her life was straining against her teeth. More wine, girl, Carmody said, holding back the empty glass without a glance, and Rosalind Ellery took it from his hand and filled it and gave it back to the man who had killed her father, and curtsied, and said, "Of course, sir," in the pleasant blank voice of a servant, and Carmody never once looked at her face, and turned back to his lordlings, and that was his first mistake of the evening, and very nearly his last good moment in England. For the woman he had not troubled to look at unpinned her shawl then, so that the candlelight could reach the grey of her dress and whatever she had pinned to it, and drifted back unhurried toward the bright centre of the room and the watching guests, because the hour, she had decided, listening to him swirl his stolen wine, was very nearly come, and a patient woman knows that the last thing required of her patients is to stop being invisible at precisely the right moment. It was the brooch that undid the disguise, in the end, as the truest things so often undo our careful lies. The Dowager Viscountess Carstairs was old now, and had buried most of the friends of her youth, and she had been standing near the windows, being bored by a bishop, when the housekeeper passed with a tray, and the candlelight caught a small dark fire of garnets at the grey breast, and the dowager, who forgot a great many things lately, did not forget that brooch, because she had stood up with the woman who first wore it, 40 years before. At her wedding. She had held that brooch in her own hand at a christening. It had belonged to Honoria Ellery, and Honoria Ellery had been dead these dozen years, and there was only one person on God's earth who would be wearing it now. Rosalind? The old woman's voice cut through the music, sharp with the shock of it. She caught the housekeeper's grey sleeve with a trembling jewelled hand and turned her toward the light and looked into the still dark face she had last seen on a child of 16 at a funeral. Rosalind Ellery. It is. Good God, child, what are they? And then, taking in the grey dress and the keys and the Duke's house and the snapping fingers of the woman who had called her girl, the Dowager Viscountess Carstairs understood that she was looking at Sir Thomas Ellery's daughter being passed as a servant in a ballroom full of the people who had let her father be destroyed, and the old woman's face went white with an old aristocrat's outrage, and she said, far too loudly, into a lull in the music, "What in the name of heaven is Sir Thomas Ellery's daughter doing carrying a tray in this house?" And the whisper began. It went out from the windows the way fire goes through dry grass. Ellery, the housekeeper, is an Ellery, Sir Thomas Ellery's girl, the one Carmody ruined, here in grey fetching wine, family to family, fan to fan, the oldest and most delicious kind of scandal, and it ran ahead of the music to the farthest corners of the ballroom and gathered weight as it went, because the older guests remembered Ellery Court, and the younger ones could see a beautiful catastrophe taking shape, and none of them could yet make it cohere into sense. A duke's housekeeper who was a baronet's ruined daughter. It was a humiliation, a curiosity, a delicious cruelty. It did not become fear until the rest of the truth arrived, and the rest of the truth arrived because Rosalind Ellery decided the hour had come. The Duke reached her first through the thickening crowd, his careful composure cracked clean across. He had seen the Dowager seize her, he had heard the name spreading, he had spent the entire evening dreading exactly this. The premature collapse of the disguise, Carmody alerted before the trap was sprung. "Rosalind," he said low, taking her arm, his face stricken. "Forgive me, this was a mistake, the whole of it. I should never have let you. We must get you out. Before he understands, before Theodore." She did not move toward the door he was steering her to. She stood quite still in the middle of the room with the whisper breaking over both of them, and she put her hand over his and her face. For the first time that evening was entirely her own. "Stop, do not apologize, and do not protect me, and do not, above all, get me out of this room. I let them call me housekeeper because I wished to stand here unseen until the precise moment I chose to be seen, and the moment has chosen itself, which is better than I could have arranged. You married a patient woman, not a fragile one. I have waited 8 years for a room with Carmody in it and all of society watching. I am not going to spend it being escorted to a carriage." Her hand tightened on his. "Trust me. Stand beside me and trust me and watch. That is all I have ever needed from anyone, and you are the only person who has ever given it." The corner of her mouth moved. "Now take me to our guest of honour, and when I tell you to acknowledge your wife, your grace, do it loudly." The Duke of Aldermere looked at the woman he had married, at the storm standing serene in the centre of his ballroom, and he understood at last that he had spent the evening trying to shield someone who had never for one moment needed shielding, that he had married not a victim to be protected, but a force to be unleashed, and that the kindest and bravest thing he could do was to stop trying to save her and let her save them both. Loudly he agreed, "God help me, I have never wanted to do anything so much." And he offered the housekeeper his arm, in front of 400 people, and led her through the parting, murmuring crowd towards Sir Hugh Carmody. Carmody had heard the whisper too, and Carmody was no fool, and Carmody made his move the moment he saw the Duke crossing the floor with the Ellery girl on his arm, because a man does not survive 40 years of ruining people without learning to strike the instant he is threatened. "Aldermere," he said, loudly, genially, turning the full weight of his presence on the approaching pair before they could speak, seizing the room's attention to bend it his way. "What is this absurd little drama your servants are enacting? Some grey woman claiming a great name?" He laughed and let his voice carry, cold beneath the warmth. "I knew the Ellerys. Sad business. All of it. A foolish man who ruined himself with debt and left a daughter to drift into service, as such girls do. If this is the creature, she has my pity, but she has no business frightening your guests with a dead name. And you, your grace, the threat slid in, silk over steel, pitched for the Duke alone and the few near enough to hear. You would do well to remember whose paper sits in my strong-box before you lend your arm to a housekeeper's theatricals. I should hate to have to be practical about Aldermere on such a pleasant evening. It was beautifully done. It reminded the Duke of the debt, branded Rosalind a deluded servant, and offered the room a comfortable story to believe, all in 3 sentences. And it very nearly turned the tide, because 400 people would always rather believe the powerful man than the woman in grey. It would have turned it, but for what Rosalind Ellery did next. She let go of her husband's arm, and she stepped forward on her own into the centre of the room, and she unpinned her mother's garnet brooch from her grey dress and held it up so the candlelight caught it, and she spoke, not loudly, but in the clear, carrying voice of a woman who had been silent for 8 years and had a great deal saved up. "My name is Rosalind Ellery," she said, "and I am the Duchess of Aldermere, married to this man these 2 years, and I have spent this evening as your housekeeper because I wished to see which of you would trouble to look at me. None of you did. That is quite all right. Sir Hugh Carmody has not troubled to truly look at me either, in 8 years, and it is the most expensive carelessness of his life." She turned to face him fully. "You say my father ruined himself with debt. Here is the debt." And she drew from inside her grey bodice, not jewels but papers, the bribed clerk's sworn and witnessed confession. The true figures, the forged default in the hand of Carmody's own commissioning, and she laid them open, one after another, on the supper table where the whole craning room could see. And she read the worst of them aloud in that carrying voice, the date, the forgery, the bribe, the name, while Sir Hugh Carmody's genial face came apart in front of the only audience he had ever cared about. "You manufactured the default that killed my father," she said, "to steal land you wanted, and you have done the same to a dozen houses in this room's memory, and you are doing it now, this season, to Aldermere, and I have spent 8 years a governess and a companion, and, tonight, a housekeeper, gathering the proof of every bit of it. Because I knew that one day you would stand in a room you could not buy your way out of, with all the people you have bled watching, and I would be holding it." She set the last paper down. "I have copies lodged with 3 solicitors and a magistrate, so do not trouble to snatch at these. The debt you hold over my husband was got by the same fraud as the one that hanged over my father. It will not survive a king's bench that has seen these. Nothing of yours will." She looked at him, almost gently, the patient look of a woman at the end of a very long wait. "You should have looked at the housekeeper, Sir Hugh. We are the ones who see everything." And the fear that had been only a delicious whisper became, in that moment, real and cold and general. For it was not only Carmody who was undone by those papers. Half the room owed him. Half the room had looked the other way while he worked. Half the room had its own buried defaults and bribed clerks, and every guilty soul in that ballroom understood at once that the quiet woman they had snapped their fingers at had spent the evening watching them, and might be holding their secrets too. By midnight the whole glittering assembly was afraid of the papers, of the reckoning, of the patient invisible woman in grey who had been among them all along. The only man in the room who did not look afraid was Sir Hugh Carmody, who had gone past fear into ruin and stood grey and finished by the supper table, and the Duke of Aldermere, who had spent the evening braced to protect a fragile wife and was now watching her dismantle the most dangerous man in England with her mother's brooch in one hand and 8 years of patience in the other, did not look afraid either. He looked. The guests would later agree. like a man witnessing the thing he had not known he was waiting his whole life to see. He crossed to her through the silence, and he took her hand before the whole of staring society, and he said, loud, as she had asked, with no apology in it anywhere, "Let me make it plain, since my housekeeper has been too modest. This is Rosalind, Duchess of Aldermere, my wife, the cleverest and most patient soul in this kingdom, and the only person in this room I am not, at present, ashamed of." He raised her hand to his lips. "Write that in your morning letters." Later, when the magistrates' men had come, and the guests had fled to carry the night across London, and the great house stood half-emptied, and ringing with the quiet after a storm, the Duke found his wife alone at last in the long gallery, still in her housekeeper's grey, the brooch in her hand. He did not say anything clever. He had run out, that night, of the careful armour of his rank, and what was left was only the man who had ridden 11 miles in the rain to be told the truth. "I spent 2 years afraid I had married a woman the world would break," he said, "and tonight I watched her break the world instead, and I find I have never in my life been so entirely outmatched, nor so glad of it." He reached up and brushed his thumb once across the back of her hand where it closed around the brooch. "I do not love the Duchess they all saw tonight, Rosalind, though God knows she was magnificent. I love the woman who told me my own loneliness to my face in a sick room and was not afraid I would dismiss her for it. I have loved her since the Gibbon. I only wanted once to say it in a room where I was not pretending you were the help." And Rosalind Ellery, who had been patient for 8 years and had nothing left that night to be patient for, set down the keys and let him say it, and answered him not with words, but by closing the last small distance herself. And the kiss that ended 8 years of waiting was brief and quiet, and meant the whole of everything. And what broke open in her was the final frozen thing she had carried since she was 16 and left a house with one trunk, the belief that justice and tenderness could not be had in the same life by the same woman. She had just been proved wrong about that, in front of 400 people, and she found she did not mind being wrong at all. Sir Hugh Carmody was arrested within the month on the evidence Rosalind had lodged, and the defaults he had built his fortune upon were unwound one after another in the courts, and he died a few years later in much reduced circumstances, abroad, dunning his remaining relations for loans and the great families of London, who had welcomed him for his money and dropped him in a single night for his exposure, agreed afterward that they had never really liked him, which was the only eulogy he was ever given. The Duke's debts, got by the same fraud, were struck down with the rest, and Aldermere came free of the shadow that had hung over it since his father's day. Ellery Court itself the Duke bought back, quietly, the following year, and gave to his wife outright, not as a gift, he was careful to say, but as a restitution the world owed her and could not be trusted to pay, so he had paid it himself, and Rosalind walked again through the rooms she had left at 16 with one trunk, no longer invisible, no longer patient. A woman whose long account was settled at last. They were not quiet about the marriage after that night. There was no longer any reason to be, and a good deal of reason not to be, for Rosalind Ellery, Duchess of Aldermere, became in a single season the most sought-after and most quietly feared hostess in London, sought for her wit and her husband's name. Feared because every soul who had ever snapped their fingers at a housekeeper now wondered, uneasily, what else she had seen from the edges of their drawing-rooms. She found the fear useful and the sought-after part tedious, and said so, and her husband loved her the more for it. On the night Ellery Court was hers again, she pinned her mother's garnet brooch to a gown that was not grey, and stood with the Duke at the window of her old home, and he asked her whether she would put the brooch away now that the waiting was done, now that there was nothing left to avenge and no disguise left to wear. "No," Rosalind said, turning it to the light, the small dark fire of it that an old woman had recognised across a crowded ballroom. The one thing she had carried through 8 years of being no one. "I wore it when I had nothing, to remember who I was. I shall wear it now that I have everything, to remember the same thing. It is the only jewel I own that they cannot have given me and cannot take away." And out beyond the window the Hertfordshire dark lay over the restored house and the recovered land, and the wind moved through the old trees that had watched a girl leave with one trunk and a brooch, and watched, now, a duchess come home, patient, at the last, no longer.